From Moscow, Dr. Andrei Kortunov, Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. From New Delhi, TCA Rangachari, former Ambassador of India to Algeria, Germany and France. And from Beijing, Dr. Zhao Hai, Research Fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And from Johannesburg, Dr. Sele Tebe, Director of Cross-Cultural Communication Strategies Agency that's called Sele Encounters. Let me bring in my co-host Peter from South Africa. Hello, Peter.
Hello, Liu Xin. Thanks very much indeed, and welcome from the host city, Johannesburg. We're all very excited in this part of the world for what promises to be quite a summit.
Indeed, I would love to be there, but I cannot be, so that's why we're having this here. Tell us a bit about this year's event. What are the key words we're talking about?
I think if we take a look at the theme of the summit, the key words that are coming to mind are inclusive growth and shared prosperity, as well as the fourth industrial revolution. Given the global economic challenges that the globe is facing, and particularly the developing nations, one of the issues, particularly on the continent here in Africa, is that of poverty, inequality and unemployment, particularly around young people. So inclusive growth, very, very important, that nobody gets left behind and that the prosperity of the continent is shared amongst all its citizens. So that's going to be a big issue. And then the fourth industrial revolution, of course, we're finding ourselves with this technological era that's coming through. And this could be a good and a game changer for the continent, because we can leapfrog some of the development processes that developed nations had to go through by embracing this technology. But we also need to skill ourselves. So conversations around future skills, the skills required to embrace the fourth industrial revolution, are going to be key, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. It's also the second time for South Africa to host the summit, and it marks the milestone of 10 years, the first 10 years of BRICS as a group. What will South Africa bring to the meeting this time?
I think what we'll probably see much more of is a larger African voice. I believe that there'll be as many as 9 other African leaders at this year's summit. While South Africa is the only permanent member of this grouping, it's quite important that the African voice is heard as part of these discussions. So bringing 9 African leaders to this meeting is going to be very, very important, so that Africa feels that it's also part of some of the decisions that are being made by these BRICS nations. And also this year we're celebrating what would have been Nelson Mandela's 100th birthday. So a great champion in fostering equality. The summit is going to be allowing some kind of celebration of Nelson Mandela. So this is something that we're very excited about.
Great. So we're going to start our panel discussion, and I'll lead the first part, and later on I'll be handing back to you, Peter. Talk to you in just a moment. And now let's start our first block of panel discussions. The topic for this block of discussion is really how BRICS countries can unite to fight protectionism and unilateralism. We know China, Brazil, Russia, India and South Africa have agreed to fight against trade protectionism together after meeting during the Group of 20 summit of finance ministers and central bankers in Buenos Aires. That's according to a statement by the Chinese Ministry of Finance, which was posted on their website most recently. The statement says BRICS should firmly support support economic globalization and multilateralism and unequivocally oppose unilateralism and protectionism in any form. Let's talk about how BRICS members can tackle or take advantage of this challenge if possible. Mr. Ma, coming from Brazil, as China has targeted American soybeans in retaliation of U.S. tariffs, Brazilian farmers are likely to benefit from this spat. What's Brazil's position on this?
Thank you for the question, Ms. Liu. I think Brazil, it's a yes and no answer for that. In the short term, and Brazil would definitely benefit from the issue because it replaced the import from U.S. to Brazil. Well, after you talk with the agricultural sector, which is a quite organized sector in Brazil nowadays, there are also some concerns in the midterm and long-term effect because a lot of the protectionism ends up in a lot of discussions and a lot of agreements between the countries, and in somehow, some way, all the parts of the agribusiness in Brazil might be left behind, such as the meat production and animal protein, might be affected indirectly because of this later agreement. So at the first stance, we are very cautious into that. Brazilian producers are very cautious. Yes, in the beginning, the short term is beneficial, but there is a very serious concern that in the long term, it will bring difficulties to other sectors of agribusiness in Brazil.
Mm-hmm. Now, looking to the perspective of India, Professor Swaran Singh at the Center of International Politics, Organization and Disarmament at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, he said India would like the summit to continue its request for ensuring free, fair and transparent global trade practices that have come under threat. But India is also saying that it must ensure that the BRICS forum does not become patently anti-American. So, dear Ambassador Rangachari, how much is India in step with China and the other members on this? Does it have split loyalties?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me for this discussion, and also greetings from India to my co-panelists. Now, insofar as the question of whether we are together on this issue, I think we have to look at it in two separate perspectives. One is the global perspective, where I think at the level of principle, everybody is on the same page. That is to say that globalization and the fact that markets are being opened up by the developed countries has helped all the developing and emerging economies. So to that extent, the fact that there is a tendency towards either unilateralism or protectionism does not help us at all. So we are, in that context, in principle, we are all together on the same page. But I think we have to then also look at our own policies and see whether towards each other, that is to say, one BRICS member country towards another BRICS member country is also imposing any kind of restrictions on trade and so on. Now, there are issues between, for example, India and China. There are issues in regard to other participants within the BRICS countries as to how we should approach the issue of trade. My own view on this is that because China is 65% of BRICS and the other four countries constitute 35% of BRICS, therefore, the countries should look at how we can help each other, and to the extent to which our own policies are not in consonance with the principle of openness, of transparency, of free trade, we should see how we can adjust this. And in that context, we should try and give preference to the interests of other BRICS members so that our own respective markets are more easily accessible by other BRICS members. And of course, in extension, it would also become accessible to other developing and emerging economies.
So from China, Dr. Zhao Hai from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, would you like to address what Ambassador Rangachari had just mentioned, that although in principle BRICS members all support free trade, but on the other hand, within the BRICS organization, maybe the trade practices are not so much in line with this principle?
Well, first of all, I agree with the ambassador, what he said about looking inside and try to break down barriers between the countries within the BRICS, and improving the mechanism within BRICS and make it work better for every country is definitely the good solution. However, I think this is not a either-or question. On the one hand, we should improve and make the mechanism work better among ourselves, but on the other hand, we need to unite it against the rising tide of protectionism and unilateralism from from the United States. I want to emphasize this. I think there's only a group of people within the United States holding these ideas. This does not represent everything from the United States, and we should unite not only among ourselves, but also we should accept part of the United States who still believe that free trade is the pillar of modern society, and we should unite against the idea within the United States, and particularly within the Trump administration.
Let me hear the opinion of our Russian guest, Dr. Kortunov. Now, sanctions on Russia remain in place, if not getting more. Iran is also being put under sanctions very soon. Let's not forget Iran is an important trading partner for Russia, China, and India, and the United States has also imposed tariffs on Russian steel and aluminum, not to mention the Russia phobia that's been central to American politics at this moment. So what kind of function, what kind of role do you think the BRICS mechanism or platform can play in terms of defending Russia's interests in the global free trade?
Well, I think that Russia is really concerned about the U.S. sanctions. The Russian-American trade is not substantial, but the United States sets a dangerous precedent because the American sanctions are not clearly defined, and they can be used not only against Russia, but also against other countries that work with Russia. For example, U.S. sanctions can, in principle, hit the Indian defense sector, which is definitely not something that the United States would like to see. So I think that, first of all, it is important for Russia to feel support from other BRIC members in terms of their overall opposition to sanctions. But also, I think for Russia it is important to diversify as much as possible its own trade, so that BRICS countries will play a more significant role in the Russian overall trade.
At this moment, what do you think is holding Russia back from trading more with BRIC member states?
Well, I think that Russia will reciprocate. Definitely, we will see some restrictions on American companies operating in Moscow. But if you take the size of the U.S.-Russian trade, it amounts to approximately $20 billion. So it's a drop in a bucket. The big issue is whether the United States is trying to impose additional sanctions on European partners of the Russian Federation, whether the United States is ready to apply their sanctions extraterritorially. For example, if the United States is trying to kill a new Russian-German pipeline project in the North Sea, the so-called Nord Stream 2, this is something very serious, and that means that Russia should look for other markets outside of Europe.
Right. Basically, French foreign minister is also talking about a trade war literally happening between the EU and the United States at this particular moment.
Exactly.
Everybody is at a trade war with everybody, or the United States is at a trade war with literally everybody. So I want to go to our South African friend here. Have African countries been caught in the middle of this multilateral or one against all trade war between the United States, China and EU at least, all of which are most important trading partners for Africa? What is the position of South Africa on this?
Look, BRICS as a bloc, it's a very coherent bloc, and it was built exactly for this reason. It was built to complement and as an alternative to the dependence on the West for South-South cooperation. So I'm looking at BRICS as a very coherent arm of the South-South cooperation, and instead of the sanctions that we see now, or the trade war that is occurring now, instead of us looking at them as a bigger problem, let's look at them as an opportunity to redress the trade. So Africa maybe will get an opportunity to focus more to China with its trade and economic, and also this will offer an opportunity for BRICS institutions to streamline themselves on the African territory. So I don't think it's a problem. If it's a problem, it is merely a trading glitch, which we all have. But also, what is happening with the United States now, it's not the United States that should be in question. What should be in question is that how ready is the South-South cooperation and BRICS able to use the institutions that they've established. So the situation that we have at present, the one of the rise of unilateral world, the one of protectionism, offers opportunity for BRICS to exert itself, because BRICS is designed to cover different regions of the world. And these regions of the world should now converge together through the institutions that they have, the new development bank, the contingency reserve arrangements, and in Africa, the African Regional Center of the BRICS Bank. So this is the time that these institutions should test themselves. Speaking as an African, as a South African as well, we already have renminbi, which offsets the power of the greenback. So this should be the time also to see that will show that will enable BRICS to mitigate the problems that might rise. So I'm looking at this as an opportunity for BRICS countries to test themselves.
Yeah. Mr. Ma, from the Brazilian perspective, how does Brazil look at the future of BRICS, not just to counter the short-term problems of a trade war or trade wars, but really to lift South-South cooperation to have a stronger voice and collectively to have more representation in the world?
I think so. I do agree with our fellow panelists in South Africa. I think the BRICS bloc, it's an extremely coherent bloc. And when you look at it, we got a lot of more complementarities in our economies than similarities. So there's definitely a lot of room for us to develop, to grow. Obviously, the process is not that easy. I think that we should look back, do a little bit, each country do a little bit of homework and see what its need, what are the requirements. And as you mentioned, as the fellow panelist in South Africa mentioned, the new development bank, I mean, the BRICS Bank is coming to show up, and we are seeing it's a lot of movements, particularly for Brazil. We're certainly partnering with local institutions to give them a local strength to pursue and push to a lot of the projects that Brazil had been needing so eagerly for several years. So I definitely agree that, you know, it's a good opportunity for BRICS to show up its strength.
Yeah. Ambassador Changa, Ambassador Rangachari, what is your take on the kind of challenges preventing the BRICS to be stronger at this moment? How can BRICS collaborate, cooperate better so that they can really use this platform to address the fundamental development problems that they are faced with?
Well, first of all, I think we have come a long way in the course of the last 10 years. There are a number of decisions that the leaders have taken in regard to their vision for the future, the way in which BRICS would develop, the kind of alternatives that the BRICS would place forward to the world at large, the kind of relationships that the BRICS would develop with other bodies. In fact, in this forthcoming summit also, the G77, Mercosur, CARICOM, OIC, and Asia-South Africa Strategic Partnership will all be represented as institutions. So this process of dialogue and coordination can expand further. So that's one very positive sign that has emerged in the course of the last 10 years. At the same time, we also have to see that the intra-BRICS trade and intra-BRICS investment is barely 5% of the individual BRICS countries' trade and investment with the rest of the world. There is a huge potential there for everybody to work together. Insofar as India is concerned, we run something like a $50+ billion deficit with China, and each of the other BRICS countries we run anywhere from $1 to $5 billion of deficit. So there is a great potential for India to take advantage of the markets of the other BRIC countries. Equally, there is advantage for the other BRICS countries to take advantage of the Indian market. India is growing at somewhere around 7% plus. The IMF says that we are the fastest growing emerging economy in the world. So there is a great deal of advantage, and this can only come about if we look upon ourselves as setting an example to the rest of the world, even at a time when we are being challenged by protectionism, by unilateralism and so on, to say that it is possible through a process of international cooperation, through political will, through decisions that we make to benefit ourselves and our partners, to break the shackles that might be imposed by these.
Okay. Now we are going to hand over to my co-host Peter Ndoro, who is a presenter with the South African Broadcasting Corporation. Peter, for the South African take on this year's summit. Peter, the floor is yours.
Jin, thank you very much indeed. Yes, it's a great gathering for the continent, not just for South Africa. And I wonder, though, what the view is of our friends from across the BRICS nations. Can I start with you, Dr. Zhao, in Beijing? We've always wondered, what's in it for China? Many people would suggest that BRICS without China doesn't really have much clout. So what's in it for China to be part of BRICS?
Well, that's probably not true, because China, after the 19th Party Congress, championed the idea of a community for shared future. And China is very much not only trying to lead, but also trying to bring all countries from the world together to move forward, particularly on free trade issues and also on South-South cooperation to improve trade investments between the countries, not only within BRIC, but also on the platform of BRIC Plus. So I think the meeting of the summit of BRIC now is very important. Last year, China was the host, and this year it will be South Africa. So I think in this respect, China is very much looking forward to meet with other countries within BRIC and also other countries in the Africa continent. We're looking forward to cooperation between the countries, and also we're looking forward to innovation, interconnectedness, and also China trying to use the opportunity of the Belt and Road Initiative to bring on board all those countries in Africa, trying to have them all develop and share the prosperity of the future in the continent.
All right, let's talk a little bit about Brazil. Mr. Ma, this will be the third and final trip for Brazilian President Michel Temer, and I wonder what is going to be important for him and important for Brazil in this, his last time at the summit.
Yeah, that's a very good question, Peter. I think that we are going through an interesting time. This is the last year of the administration of President Temer. And I think he will be looking into fostering the trade and especially particularly the investment into Brazil. And as I can mention to you, we are seeing a lot of diversification. I mean, China has been a main player, but more recently, as even Ambassador Hagachari mentioned, there was a lot of change. We've seen a lot of show-ups in the Indian companies. In the last auctions of energy transmission lines, we've seen a presence, very intense presence of Indian companies, which shows we are diversifying the pool of investors invested in Brazil. And I think this is the push that we're gonna keep moving.
Ambassador Rangachari, a question perhaps for all of the countries outside of South Africa. Do you think that the BRICS nations understand the needs of Africa and that there is total reciprocity between the nations?
Well, let me begin by saying that I think insofar as India is concerned, there is also an emotional connect between India and South Africa. You mentioned earlier that this was going to be the centenary of Nelson Mandela's birth. Next year is the 150th anniversary of the birth of Mahatma Gandhi. And you know the close association that Mahatma Gandhi had with South Africa itself, and in the larger context with Africa, with the independence of our own independence, plus the kind of vision that he set out for emancipation of all colonized peoples. So there is an emotional connect which is very, very important, and that is very useful in promoting people-to-people contact and an understanding between the peoples of Africa and India. At the material level, in the course of the last few years, we have created this new forum for cooperation between India and Africa. The regional heads of Africa are all participants. We have had 3 summits in India. There is also a separate channel in which Japan is also a participant, though Japan is not part of the BRICS. And therefore, insofar as India's interest, either at the emotional level or at the material level is concerned, we, I think, would continue to play the role.
Dr. Kortunov, Russia and a lot of the world are caught in the middle of a, I suppose, diplomatic trade wars, whatever you want to call it, with the US. And some of it is somewhat reminiscent of the Cold War, and we saw during that time Russia and China courting Africa to get them on side. And I wonder, with BRICS and what's happening with America at the moment, are we going through a second Cold War of sorts? And that is China, Russia trying to bring Africa on side?
Well, of course, the world is very different from what it was some 50 years ago during the real Cold War. But I think that for Russia, Africa is still an underinvested portfolio. The Soviet Union, as you probably remember, was very active in Africa, and it supported the national liberation movement on the continent. But after the Soviet disintegration, Moscow gravitated towards the West, and I think that it lost many of its positions in Africa. Today, one of maybe very few positive side effects of this conflict between Russia and the West is that in Moscow they finally focus their attention on the non-Western world, and definitely Africa is a large part of this world. So I do hope that, among other things, the summit of BRICS in Johannesburg would also articulate this new interest towards Africa. I think that Russia can definitely engage not just in bilateral cooperation, but in joint projects with China and with India, which will be important economically and socially for Russia's traditional partners in the African continent.
All right, so here's a question for all of you, and I want to get a response from each one of you. Africa has just signed a free trade agreement recently, but for this to happen and for it to realize its full potential, we are desperate to develop infrastructure, and I just wonder how the BRICS grouping can help Africa with this journey, because we're talking about shared prosperity and developing our economies together. How can the BRICS nations beyond South Africa help Africa with its growth?
I think all the countries in BRICS bloc knows that China is a powerhouse of infrastructure building. We have a lot of companies, basically world top 500 companies that are capable of building railroads, bridges, ports. So I think in this respect, China can contribute a lot to the infrastructure projects within South Africa. At the same time, I think countries can work together to improve the new development bank as well as AIIB to contribute to the financing of infrastructure projects in South Africa. So I think countries work together, we can improve the conditions on the ground and also trying to facilitate the further improvement of infrastructure in South Africa and also improve economic conditions for African people.
Mr. Ma, what about Brazil? What can they bring to the party for the continent?
And I do believe that we will stand more closer to you, to Africa, than into China, India. I think traditionally Brazil has been the recipient of foreign investments rather than investing in other countries. So that we will stand and